driven by ideological operators working at the highest levels, including the Department of Education, the US federal government, and the United Nations through UNESCO, to bring this to our children, to transform them into a revolutionary gender or sexual identity that splits them from their family, puts them at odds with their society, leaves them with few options so they'll be destabilized and wish to revolt, just like Mao's Red Guard.
Oh, buddy. Oof, yeah, Mama had her script printed. She knew. So we're just all sheeple and pawns being used by big whoever to overthrow the government. Well, if that's what we were placed here to do, we're not doing a great job. We haven't overthrown the government, so as long as we don't overthrow the government, we won't be discarded by this unnamed figure who's manipulating us like a puppet master. Oh, James Lindsay, what are you a doctor in? Hello, you stunning woman on the go. My name is David and you are watching Dismantling Hate. Today, we are getting back into the world of Genspect, and they published a video that is titled How Schools Are Being Queered by Dr. James Lindsay. And as an educator, admittedly a queer educator, I felt particularly called to this video today. The description of the video says, Session 2 of the ROGD Awareness Day Conference 2024. ROGD Awareness. I'm terrified to look that up. ROGD, what do you suppose that means? Awareness Day, okay, it was the fourth one down, and it links to their website, Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria.
Girl, please. No.
Awareness Day is held annually on August 16th. It's the anniversary of the publication of the study that first used the term ROGD. So the AI overview says ROGD is a controversial hypothesis that some adolescents experience gender dysphoria and identify as transgender due to social contagion and peer influence.
Sorry.
It is not recognized as a valid mental health diagnosis by any major professional association. That's because it doesn't exist.
Next.
Like rapid onset gender dysphoria, you could have that. Your gender dysphoria could rapidly onset. Oh, get it. This is gonna be, I hope you have a drink. I have a coffee here. This is gonna be a long one. Their argument here is that the rapid onset of that gender dysphoria is solely due to social contagion. If I have a trans friend, I'm gonna wanna be trans. And you know what? Is that possible? Absolutely. I'm getting so far ahead of myself. Hi, I'm David They. Did I say that? This is Dismantling Hate. Just a side note, how long do we spend of our lives moisturizing? This is going to be a more casual video, I tell myself, as I inevitably start talking for 14 hours. I'm gonna put on some makeup as we're watching this. It's a 45-minute video. We're gonna see why rapid onset gender dysphoria is actually touted by people like Dr. James Lindsay. We're gonna roll the intro and let's get into how schools are being queered. What a treat. How long have I had that fluff on my face? Hopefully not long. Okay, Dr. James Lindsay, love a first name, last name situation. Take us away. I'm just gonna look very unimpressed this entire time. But you will, right? You will too, you will too.
I'm Jennifer Law. I hail from the great sanctuary state of California.
Like, I don't want to stop every 2 seconds, but her saying I hail and then sanctuary state, like this language is already specific. I don't know what it's specifying, but it is very specific, you know? Like, people don't say hail. People don't say hail. People don't say sanctuary state unless there's some weird stuff going on. And I wonder what that weird stuff is going to be.
Welcome. I bring you greetings from Gavin Newsom. Thank you. I'm glad this is live stream. Anyway, I'm happy to be part of the Genspect team, and it's my honor to introduce our next guest. If you don't know him, he's a delightful human being. I can't decide if he's more fun on X or in person. It's a toss-up. But our next speaker is Dr. James Lindsay. I know a lot of you have read his books and listen to his podcast. He is an author, a mathematician, political.
I didn't have that full screen until now, so I did wear a collared shirt specifically for the education video, and I just filmed a really long one on AI in education that wasn't reactionary like this or makeup. It was just full researched content. So if you want to watch that, that's up there on my channel. So I'm a little bit bleh now. You get it.
I'm a commentator. He's written a ton of books. I can't keep track, but it says on his bio he's written 8 at this point. He's also the founder of New Discourses, so sign that, Substacks, subscribe, join. He's the co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. It's a great book. And he's the author of Race Marxism, as well as his newest book, another great book, The Marxification of Education.
Oh, God.
He's often on the media. He's been on Joe Rogan many times. He's been on Jordan Peterson. He spoke at the Oxford Union. You can watch that debate online on YouTube. It's really a fun debate.
It's so interesting, though, because these folks use those examples. Like, he's been on Joe Rogan. He's been on Jordan Peterson, or however the hell you say it, as like a flex. But then people who actually understand words and things, they hear that and they go, yikes. That's not something to be bragging about. But I guess those are also the circles that I'm not a part of. So maybe to somebody that's a flex. That's embarrassing to me. I'm sure what I'm doing here would be embarrassing to many as well. Life can go any way you want it to. Starting with the empty platitudes, that's not a good sign for us. No, we're going to have a great time.
And he recently spoke at the European Parliament as well. So I bring you Dr. James Lindsay.
Okay, thank you. This is for your protection. This is a timer. We got to keep you safe. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time. The problem is...
It's a good line. It's a good line. I'll give him that. I want to use that myself.
About two different whole talks I kind of want to give to you because I couldn't quite decide what I wanted to say. So I'll just warm you up a little bit by telling you, Dr. Bailey just spoke and he said he was going to say something controversial and my heart smiled. I was like, my sweet summer child. So this might be a little bit controversial. So both of these two topics that I actually kind of want to find time to address are going to be a bit controversial. It's maybe a different way. If you know my work, it's not a different way. But if you're not familiar with my work, this is going to be a bit of a different characterization. I primarily study the ideology, what you guys in this room probably would refer to as gender ideology.
Just the way he's looking at people is really interesting to me. I might be reading way too much into it, but the way he's almost looking out at the audience as if he is seeking to be affirmed by the eye contact of other folks, Like he's kind of looking around and like, right, guys, that stuff, that gender ideology stuff, like, I don't know. It might just be me. And ideology is such an interesting word. Echo, what does ideology mean?
Ideology is usually defined as the body of doctrine, myth, belief, etc., that guides an individual, social movement, institution, class, or large group. For more, ask me to give you more definitions for ideology.
No, that's enough. Thanks. Yes, it answered my question. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure what went wrong.
Nothing went wrong for once. That's the problem with this, is that the word ideology is so broad and it can mean so much. So you studying the ideology, what does that actually mean? But if you leave things more ambiguous to an audience who is not very educated, they just fill in the blanks with whatever would make the most sense for them. And I guess that's not always related to education, but I used to think like that, and it's through my years of university education that I don't think like that anymore. So maybe other folks could get there other ways. In fact, I know they can, but that's how I did it. So that's kind of how I think. We're all biased. We're all so incredibly biased, but as we move through the world and have new experiences, we build ways to recognize that bias and not let it impact our behaviors. And folks like this, in my experience, usually don't like to do new things, think new ways, have their ways of thinking, have their ideology challenged. And I love that. I love being challenged. I love going to bed after watching a Dismantling Hate video like this, and I go, what if that guy's right? Like, you need to be thinking that. You need to be looking from the other side and going, have I been wrong this whole time? And I think that all the time. But it's Often, always, immediately followed up by research and science and all of these things that I can actually point to and say, no, that's not right because of this. You need to be flexibly rigid, you know? You need both. You need to be able to think you're wrong sometimes, and I don't see that from these folks.
As this kind of co-created, related, cross-pollinating ideological framework called queer theory attached to it. And my most recent book, The Queering of the American Child, is about the insertion of queer theory
Don't say
into
insertion.
education. And so it describes what queer theory is. It actually describes how queer theory is a derivative of Marxist theory. So now we're going to start wading into that controversial water.
Okay.
And I think I'll start with an extraordinarily properly controversial sentence.
Okay.
Gender doesn't exist. Let's just get over it.
That's just the way he said that. Gender doesn't exist. Just get over it. I need to go back. I need to go back and watch his little chin movement there when he said get over it.
Gender doesn't exist. Let's just get over it.
That's good. Is that going to be a cutaway I use forever now? It's just get over it.
I spent most of the spring trying to figure out the basis for that claim, which I generally intuited and has become kind of a buzzword and the pushback against our...
He just intuited. So it just means that you thought of something without logical thought. Oh, God. I mean, I do that a lot, but then I don't get on stage and proclaim that lack of logical thought to other people and write a book about it. That's the difference.
And other trans medicine and so on. We know that our friend Billboard Chris Elston is famous for saying there are two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities, which Charlie Kirk has taken to using without credit, which is sort of funny. But it's true. There are no genders. The term gender identity arises, and I'm not going to go into this long history, but I've discovered it came from Stoller and Greenson in 1964, and what they were trying to describe was one's internal sense of being male or female, and they were very clear that it was one's internal sense of being male or female.
Okay.
So from the beginning, the thing they got called gender identity was binary, which is kind of funny because it's not any longer. And what they were actually doing, and Alex Byrne, if many of you would know from, I think he's at MIT, has done excellent work on this, kind of traced this history and pointed out that it would have been far more accurate had Stoller and Greenson not been so polite. And instead of calling what they were trying to describe as gender identity, if you would have called it, or they would have called it sex identity, one's sense of being one's sex, we could have skipped a lot of trouble. Because very infamously, what happened, just for the little history here, what happened next was a much more controversial character by the name of John Money picked up this idea from Stoller and Greenson a few years later in the late 1960s. And because he worked in what we now call, and I think it's a far better term than the previous terms, disorders of sexual development was one of his research specialties.
Okay.
He had this problem of people that it was difficult to classify cleanly, which we're still dealing with in the Olympics, obviously, in the boxing, cleanly into male or female. Now, if we had some biologists here, they would say they'd be able to explain in tremendous detail, and I'm sure maybe we have some in the room, why it's not as hard as it seems. But back when Money was writing about what he called at the time hermaphroditism, which I don't even think is a word you're allowed to say in polite culture now, and then later it got called intersex, which is a bogus term because there is no such thing as being in between sexes.
Whoa, who's throwing the B word around? Homeboy's out here saying bogus. Sure. Like, it's interesting that their argument hinges on like gender doesn't exist and being transgender is really being transsex, or the way that you feel in relation to your sex is your sex identity. Like, sure, if you want to call it that, go ahead, but trans people still exist at the end of the day. Thank you and good night. Yeah, you can change the linguistics of it, but it doesn't really change the fact that there are living, breathing human beings who are trans and they deserve to have a life equal to everybody else. And that includes playing sports. It's weird that their whole personality is just that. Right? Like, is my whole personality that? I suppose it's a really big part of it, but it's not everything. I have a feeling that this man and most people in this community would have a really hard time making friends. I don't know. I'm not even on topic of the video anymore. I'm just attacking their character specifically. But to not have an open mind, to not have a growth mindset, to not be able to engage in critical thinking, And I think, too, to not have any trans people in your life, it would be hard for them to be this hateful if they knew any trans people or knew any non binary people, right? It's hard to identify and empathize with folks that you just don't have representation of. Before I knew any trans people in real life, I did hold some transphobic beliefs. I really did. But then when I met these people and started to get to know them and love them, it just really all clicked for me personally. And I think that happens for a lot of other folks too. You need people like this in your life in order to feel like they're real people. Oh, but do you need that though, to be so shallow? I mean, I guess I was shallow in this example too. Why can't you just be nice and respect everybody? Well, I'm gonna keep going because I feel existential as heck. He said bogus, now I'm saying heck. It's getting wild.
There are disorders of sexual development. Like I said, I think that this is a better term. Well, since Money was working on those, my reading of John Money is very clearly that he was trying to describe this feeling of sex identity outlined by Stoller and Greenson while not actually referencing the essential biological fact underneath. So how do we have sex without sex? So at this point, and I mean biological sex without sex, not any of the activity stuff. And so this is a complete
Not any of that activity stuff.
divorce from reality. And so gender identity, by the time John Money is pushing it for whatever his reasons are, and I don't necessarily think these particular reasons were bad, becomes divorced from reality. It is now phenomenon precedes essence, to talk very philosophically. So it's a phenomenological...
Phenomenon proceeds essence. Interesting. The linguistical topography of that sentence is very quite nice. Phenomenon precedes essence. But is it just an empty platitude? We'll stay tuned to find out.
Philosophical approach to the concept of who we are, as opposed to an essentialist concept of who we are. And if you've read any feminist literature in the last 50 years, you know that they're not big on sex essentialism or biological essentialism. They attack it rigorously and constantly. And it turns out that
So I haven't read essentialism through the text of feminism like he's talking about here, but I've read a lot of educational literature, and essentialism... it's just not good. It's not a human-centered way of looking at things. At least in the educative contexts, we've seen through neuroscience that essentialism does not support learning. It does not support a conducive community. It does not support human connection, which I do see parallels in the way that he's talking here. Even maybe how I described earlier with him not being able to make friends, but that might be over specific. I don't know, girl. Is that lighting better? Ooh, no, it is not, honey. Nope. I've only primered, but I'm going in for color now.
The next chapter in this story, so this is where this gets really, really controversial. It's not just that gender doesn't exist, it's that we have to thank not primarily John Money for this disaster, although there are lots of reasons to thank John Money for this disaster. We have and I will be very particular here so that I don't get eggs thrown at me. We have the sex-positive radical feminists to blame for this mutation into the queer theory and gender identity.
I've heard that phrase before. Sex-positive radical feminists. I forget who said that.
Pair of ways of thinking about the world. I say that very clearly, having read Gail Rubin, who was one of these characters. Gail Rubin wrote very clearly in some essay, I forgot what the essay's called, but it's a chapter in her 2011 anthology called Deviations, near the very beginning. Actually, I think it's the introduction to Deviation, so it may be unique to that book, not one of her essays. And she said she got accused by other authors of having appropriated John Money's idea of gender, which is divorced from sex, and kind of the phenomenological, ethereal world of social norms and social expectations and social constructions. And she said, well, of course I did. But she gets accused not just of appropriating it, but not citing him, which is, it's not academic misconduct anymore, but it used to be big academic misconduct. So she defended herself and she said, of course I did. Of course I used John Money's ideas. And of course, the reason is because they were just in her own words, the air, the water, It's like the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, the food that we ate, and the conversations and all of the feminist pamphlets we were circulating through the entirety of the 1970s. So the feminist literature, radical feminist literature specifically in the 1970s, was going through a split, and it was appropriating this concept of gender identity. That kind of the end of that train track is where we are today. These are not, just to be very clear, I do like to just blame feminists for things, and then they get mad at me, and I say the hags are mad, and they get madder, and then they say James called...
The hags are mad. Isn't that interesting, the use of language like that? Like, I love hyperbolic language at somebody else's expense. It's fun. I'd love to do it with my friends. But it's done in an earnest way that I actually care about them. It's interesting. The hags are mad. The comedy's punching down. We're not surprised, but we're just saying.
Women hags, and I say, no, I call feminists hags, and that's actually a deep, important philosophical point, but that's a different talk for a different day. But it's so fun. But these are not feminists, as some of the Marxists would phrase it. These are not feminists of strict obedience. These are a new radical breed that arose primarily in the 1970s, and like I said, there were sex-positive radical feminists, which means they were very pro-sexual activity, which is not what the case was for the sex-negative radical feminists. Your Andrea Dworkins, your Susan Brown Miller. What's the other one?
He does know a lot of names. I don't know.
Forget. Catherine McKinnon are the other big famous sex-negative. These people were much more feminists of strict obedience. They were definitely talking about sex roles, and they were very clear, and they, of course, wanted to preserve this. But the proto-queer theorists, such as Gail Rubin, wanted to just kind of mix sex, gender, sexuality into this kind of fluffy morass where everything socially...
Fluffy morass. Echo, what does morass mean?
Morass is usually defined as a tract of low, soft, wet ground. For more, ask me to give you more definitions for morass.
Low, soft, wet ground. Okay, so like... Still kind of confused as to what that means, but that's okay.
And everything can be taken apart. And I'm just saying all that to set the table that there's this long ideological track that started over 50 years ago that ends us in the place where we're at a meeting today to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria. Because gender doesn't exist. Gender is a fabrication of a phenomenological, to be technical, a phenomenological interpretation of the world. In other words, to be also technical, it has a completely different metaphysic. It does not believe that reality precedes our understanding of reality. It believes that our understanding of reality is conditioned by who we are and the social circumstances that we're in. And so,
well, yeah, of course our perceptions of reality are from our internal perceptions. And Echo, what does metaphysic mean?
Metaphysics is usually defined as the branch of philosophy that treats of first principles, includes ontology and cosmology, and is intimately connected with epistemology.
I mean, he's using a lot of big words. I don't know if they mean something, but to him they do.
You, by definition, do not inhabit the same reality that I inhabit. So
well, that's correct. Our realities are based off of our experiences. Okay.
No shared reality between us, which means that our adjudications about reality are determined specifically by how much power we can exert to put forth our view of reality over others.
Okay, no, that's where you lost me, son.
And we used a process that the Marxist George Lukács called social reification to make that become true effectively in the social realm, which makes it true in the only reality that matters from this perspective. And this is what I just want to set the table, that this is what we're actually dealing with. A fundamental difference in baseline metaphysics about how the world is constructed, what our relationship to the world is. It does not follow the scientific. So a lot of people who come at this are not coming at it correctly. They need to do what they're doing with the biology and the data and all the things that we just heard in the previous talk. But they have to understand first that this ideological approach just considers all of that another unjust application of power that has to be discarded. In other words, has to be thrown into an ideological ghetto, which makes you low status if you interact with it. You are not on the
I don't like that.
Of the forward progress of history if you're doing old business like looking at data, unless you're just cooking data to make it support your conclusion. A concept I really encourage a lot of people to think about is this little phrase. I find myself using it a lot lately: a conclusion in search of an argument. And this is actually what
It's so wild to me, though, that that's what I would think about his argument here. So we can just go in circles thinking the same thing about each other.
anyways, they have concluded that not only is gender real as a phenomenon, it is primary. It is ahead of sex. That's a complete inversion of what we have. And they have that conclusion that is now in search of an argument. It is in search of supporting data. And they look for it and they find it and they twist it and they bully people and they ruin people's lives. We just heard that you're afraid to speak up because you might get called a racist. You might get called a transphobe.
Well, Bestie, are you racist? Because then you might be called You can have controversial opinions until the cows come home. But if you don't think being trans exists, then why are you afraid of being called transphobic? You know what I mean? Are those even? They're not really even, but girls, I'm just here to have fun today.
People who have completely legitimate opinions that don't agree with theirs, they make articles get retracted. If you guys don't know what actually happened to Dr. Bailey in the 90s when he started to talk about the A word, autogynephilia, you should look it up. It's funny you ask him about being canceled. The man was canceled hard before canceling was a canceling. And so it's pretty, that was actually, by the way.
The man was canceled hard before canceling was canceling. Yikes.
Dr. Bailey, one of the things that made me decide I absolutely had to dive in on this.
Dive on in?
I found out how you and your colleagues were treated for talking about this in an academic way 30 years ago. Death threats, posting information about where they lived and their family.
That's fair. Nobody deserves death threats or to be doxxed. I haven't been doxxed. Actually, I suppose I haven't received death threats either, but I've received very awful messages before. Nobody needs that.
Pictures of their kids. Run-of-the-mill operation for what kind of a person? Somebody's pushing a radical, militant ideology like Marxism, which I say all of this is derived from. So this isn't to talk about, I mean, I would love to just stand here for 2 hours and just bash feminists for it. I'm kidding. Hag's mad. Hag's mad. I would love to stand up here and talk to you about this kind of theoretical stuff, but I actually want to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria since that...
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, we're actually not talking about what the title of the video was.
Conference that we're at, or the meeting. And so I want to add a lot of color to that social factors part of what was presented by Drs. Lipman and Bailey in the previous comment, because I don't think it's merely a contagion. Now, of course, the graphs that he showed matched what I learned when I was a mathematician in a past life and I studied mathematical epidemiology. Those curves, that taking off exponential rise that we see roughly starting in 2007, the curve for the recovered memories, does it really follow this kind of bell-shaped thing? There's a theory or theorem in mathematical epidemiology called Farr's Law, F-A-R-R. Everybody should have learned about this in COVID because they were talking about how everything's going to be completely out of control and it's exponential growth and everything's going to be terrible. But they didn't actually tell you the truth. It's actually sigmoid growth, which follows Farr's Law. And we can expect that if this is indeed an epidemic, that we will see this shape of a curve. I want to give you
do you understand what he just said? Because I don't. Maybe just because I'm dumb.
More sinister interpretation than mere epidemic. I want to suggest that there is a driver, because this is ultimately ideological, which is why I wanted to briefly introduce the idea of the ideology, even though I didn't go into the details of what queer theory is. Queer theory is literally, by definition, according to David Halperin, who defined it, it is being against or opposed to, and in italics, whatever is considered normal or legit.
Wait a minute, it's coming back to me now. I reacted to the podcast that this man made and it didn't have his face and it didn't have a video component, and I sat for 2 hours and did my makeup listening to his podcast. Oh, look at that. And here I am doing my makeup again. That's interesting. That looks good, hey?
So it is a rejection on principle against normalcy, legitimacy, or as I say, it is rejecting limiting principles on principle. Anything that tells you you can't do this, including reality, like that you can't transform your sex.
It's hard though, because you can understand why that would be something that would be said by feminists. Because I've asserted that before. I don't think we should have anything limiting as long as you're not. Why is that man on my screen right now? Because
A couple tips
oh,
and tricks to
for the
improve your
love
sites
of
featuring
God.
ready-made sites that have done it right. Simplify.
I only have premium on my personal account, and I'm not bombarding my algorithm with this garbage on my personal account. Anyhow, yeah, you don't want to be limited, as long as you're not hurting yourself and others. And that's where we disagree with these people, is because they think being trans is hurting yourself and is a form of self-harm, which could it be? Absolutely, but so could food, you know? It's not that we need to teach against gender ideology. We need to teach for critical thinking skills, which would take care of both problems in question today. His problem with me and my problem with him. If we all just thought more critically, we wouldn't be here.
Sex through some magical medical process. Anything that tells you no has to be resisted on principle. This is the kind of ideological push that we're dealing with. But what I want to talk about is this social factor milieu. And I want to draw a parallel to a historical circumstance that a lot of people are vaguely familiar with, but not well read on, which is the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Because I believe that this is exactly what's driving this, especially in our young people. It's not the
What? TikTok is making us trans. Wow. There's a title for you.
factor. It's complicated. We all had to say it together, of course. It's not one thing. However, I want to tell you how Mao Zedong ran his Cultural Revolution.
Okay.
Because a lot of people don't know. Now, if you don't know the history of China, we don't have time to get into all that. Mao actually did 2 revolutions to gain power twice because he got kicked out after he botched everything with his so-called Great Leap Forward. I hate when I mess those up. I really hate when I...
But couldn't we see parallels between what he's describing here and the current state of affairs in the United States somewhere? I don't know.
The first one was a kind of a classical revolt military coup. The second one was a cultural revolution, and it started in 1966, and it primarily weaponized young people, intellectual young people in particular. So people that had been going to his schools, people that had been participating in his youth programs, had been brought up on Mao Zedong thought, and he mobilized them to destroy his political enemies and regain his seat, which he did by the end of 1967. In early 1968, he then had all the young people, 17 million of them, rounded up and sent to Gulag re-education camp to die doing hard labor or in prison.
I don't have any way, I don't know if that's true. If it is, that's horrific.
By the People's Liberation Army because they were too radical once he had power again. You don't want the destabilizers destabilizing you when you use them to steal power.
Interesting.
I think that this is an important lesson for us. But the way that Mao did this basically was that he broke the population into 2 big categories that we could call the good guys and the bad guys. He called them the people and the enemies of the people. He coded them with class colors, red and black.
Yikes.
We could also call them the people that believe we're moving forward. Those are the good people. And the people who believe that maybe there's nothing new under the sun, who are accused of supporting a thing called the status quo, or that we are not moving. So the progressives versus the non-progressives, in some sense, or the progressives versus the conservatives.
Okay, I'm sad.
If you want. And so what he did was he took these 2 categories, the red category, the black category, the good guys versus the bad guys, the people and the enemies of the people. And it's a little more subtle than that. But what he did was he made a massive incentive structure for people to join the good team and to not want to be part of the bad team. The name of that incentive structure was given by Marx and adopted by Lenin and applied by Stalin and then taken up by Mao, and it's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Mao said explicitly, as did Lenin, as did Stalin, that the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to smash your enemies. The enemies of the class, the enemies of the people have to be destroyed. But it's pretty sophisticated because Mao didn't really break the population into 2 categories. He broke them into 4 that looked like 2. And then he broke those into subdivisions that would be the birth of identity politics. So the red class, the good people, the people actually, were the laborers and the peasants that have their hammer and their sickle. That's communism.
And a sickle. Interesting.
Right? But then it was revolutionary leaders, revolutionary soldiers, revolutionary martyrs. So you actually have these 2 kind of categories within the red category. I'm not going to color code them and get weird with you, but you have these tokens. Everything's done in the name of the workers and the peasants, but they don't really care about the workers and the peasants. All you have to do is look at how the workers and especially the peasants were doing in China. They were dying by the tens of millions through starvation, exposure, murder, disease. And then you have the revolutionary classes. The goal is actually not to get people to join the red class, it's to get them to become
I'm sorry, this video is called How Schools Are Being Queered.
revolutionary activists. And then you have the black classes. The black classes are the enemies of the people. Were listed, and again, we're going to split them into two. We're listed in as follows. It was going to be your rich landlords, your landlords and your rich farmers. So rich people and landlords, big problem. And then you have
Oh yes, that is a big problem. Huh.
revolutionaries, bad elements. We call them conspiracy theorists now. Misinformation, disinformation artists. And then you had, just to really make it like broad, right-wingers. All right-wingers were on the wrong side of the society. And these black class categories were contagious, inheritable from your parents or grandparents 3 generations back, and contagious. If I spent too much time with somebody or fraternized with or helped or gave charity to somebody who was starving in the black class, even if I had red class status, I could catch black class status. In other words, it creates a social credit system that was pretty strictly enforced. This created something a little bit different than a social contagion of driving into the revolutionary class. It created a pressure pump to push people into the revolutionary class. Now, again, like I said, the black category was broken into 2 in practice, although never on paper. I think that the rich farmers and the landlords are like a scapegoat. They're the people you blame for everything going wrong so that the poor farmers and the people who don't hold land will revolt against them and have wrath. And they're the people you blame for the problem. So Mao had this speech.
Well, also, there are problems with landlords.
A speech he gave called Sweep Away the Monsters and Demons. Well, these are like the monsters, right? Then you have these people that are actively trying to prevent the development of socialism in China, and that would be the demons, your counter-revolutionaries actively fighting against bad elements, spreading misinformation and disinformation, and then your right-wingers, which he later to that added revisionists. And the goal was to attack as much as you could. In the name of the tokens, you attack the counter-revolutionaries, and then you very unjustly attack and victimize the monster class, as it would be. And the goal was to take all 3 classes and force people to want to become revolutionaries. So in our day, in our school, this is the social environment that our kids find themselves in. And this is pushed from the highest levels of our government. This is Department of Education policy. This is the kind of thing that Tiffany Justice told me a few minutes ago comes from the Circus Foundation, which is headed, is that right?
I think that just told me I can't find her.
Kamala Harris.
Sorry, was that English?
Sister Maya is significant. We'll leave it at that in the Circus Foundation. So there's massive ties between the government and big business and other entities actually working to push this. Why would businesses do this? Well, it matches their ESG score. That's why. They have to get their ESG scores if they want to.
Echo, what is an ESG score?
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
That's fair.
In the social credit system that's been built for corporations. It's exactly like the business model that works in China that Deng Xiaoping developed after Mao died, where they're going to have 1 country, 2 systems, communist government, but a literally fascist economic system that it works according to bringing glory to the communist government to advance communist goals. So there are a lot of pressures, but what is the environment for our children in this? Our children are primary targets. Our children, they understand for certain that if they want to get the future, they have to get our children. And there are lots of ways to get children. We talked about Tumblr. Tumblr was a great way to get children.
Oh, God. That's so funny that we're going after Tumblr. You know what, though? Tumblr wasn't good. Tumblr was not good.
Disordered and troubled youth spent a lot of time on that social media platform. I reckon.
You know what? That's fair. That is absolutely fair. And the promotion of unhealthy eating habits specifically that were perpetuated through Tumblr, like the pro-Anna phase, absolutely that was problematic and was, I do believe, directly perpetuated by that app. However, I don't think it was some third party being nefarious trying to put that onto people. I think that just happened because of, well, really, I watched a documentary last night that supposedly just blames Oprah for everything because she was such a ubiquitous household name and had her weight focused on in the public eye for so long. And the way that she did that was very dehumanizing, and that she brought Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil to the global stage, and now we're stuck with these characters who aren't good. Aren't good, we'll just say that. I have videos on Dr. Phil. Those are good ones. But yeah, none on Dr. Oz. He's not. Anyway, huge side tangent. But yeah, these apps can be bad for our kids. Absolutely, they can be. But it's the government who's making us trans now? I know that's being very reductionist, but let's keep going.
Them still do. The reason that Tumblr kind of fell out of the public eye isn't because it's so unpopular. It is because a few years ago, in 15 or so, they banned pornography. And all of a sudden, the thing just fell apart. So it wasn't...
You know what? That is true. That is true.
Disordered young people. They were not just talking with one another. They were engaging in online sexual behavior. And of course, this became a haven for groomers, and it was kind of famously known for being a haven for groomers who could hide behind an immense anonymity and talk to people about whatever. That's not this pressure pump. We also have generally media that's lionizing this new forward-moving, forward direction, very joyful forward direction of history, and demonizing people as transphobes or homophobes or backwards or whatever else, or misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theorists, people that don't go along. So there's a strong social pressure for people to go along with this that creates kind of a cultural milieu in which it's supported to go this way and not supported to resist it, as we already heard from the previous questioner. And more than that, it's a saturated media environment. The media companies are virtually producing, the mainstream big ones that have lots of funding are producing basically this and nothing else. Look at Disney willing to lose, over $90 billion now to continue this agenda. There are reasons that companies would be willing to lose $90 billion to keep pushing something that...
I don't know what that is in reference to. Do you know what that's in reference to?
Ordinarily unpopular with their target demographic. And none of the reasons are good. But then in the schools, it's not just that the schools are actually teaching this in the form of teaching gender ideology and aspects of queer theory to the children, as we document in Queering of the American Child. It's that the school creates a social environment in which that same dynamic in the broader public is magnified and presented to children in very stark good versus evil terms. And it's presented in very therapeutic language, and it's presented in a way that every time you have a kid who's troubled, it becomes a justification to bring more therapeutic language in. It becomes a form of universal screening in the school to find disordered or especially questioning children, whether it's questioning their sexuality or their gender or their personality or who they are or if they fit in, and then to funnel them into after-school clubs like the Gender Sexuality Alliance that then can do this.
I think this is a very two-sided coin, as they all are, because as somebody who is part of a minority myself, just being a feminine man, like most people see me as like a big beardy man, which is whatever. I see myself as non-binary. That's me, DT David They pays to advertise, but most people see me as a man, so I am in that minority of maybe gender expression. It is really hard as an educator to separate yourself from what you are teaching. And arguably, based on some of the neuroscience data and studies that have been out there, it is less effective to not bring who you are to your role as a teacher. Effectiveness of the learners around you is definitely affected if you are not genuinely yourself. But it is a very delicate dance to not project things onto your students based off of your experiences, because I've definitely done that, and that's not exclusive to teachers. That happens all around the world every day in so many situations. So yeah, what he's talking about here could and is a concern. However, when there are queer students, when there are these minorities in front of you, there needs to be support in place to help them, right? So is it possible that these potentially not queer kids are being funneled down the queer club route when they're not queer, and then they take on an identity that's not theirs and then feel like they made a mistake and wasted some years of their life. Absolutely, that's a possibility. So if that happens to 1 out of every 10 kids, right, that weighs less to me morally and psychologically than it does for 10 out of 10 kids not getting any support when they need it. You know? Everything you do can be a mistake, ultimately, at the end of the day. That doesn't mean we take away the ways in which you could make a mistake so then nobody does anything ever. It doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Kind of at scale. So it doesn't even have to be. It is in the classroom, but it doesn't have to be in the classroom.
Yeah.
The goal is to saturate the environment with the ideological perspective. Art people would call it socialist realism, but that's another talk for another day. And so this creates an enormous pressure on them, especially when they're simultaneously, here's the mal part, when they're simultaneously learning that their race is wrong, their national origin is wrong, that they're a boring, basic white girl or whatever it happens to be. And the only way to become cool and the only way to escape the negative association, the ghetto, as it were, of these black...
Why does he keep saying ghetto? But you know, there is truth to what he's saying here, or at least I have experience in this. I remember when the Black Lives Matter movement was really starting to gain national attention in 2020. And I remember talking about that with a group of students that I had at the time. And several of them walked away from that conversation just hating the fact that they were white. And that's not what I wanted to convey at all. But I think that that could be part of a healthy conceptualization of race, in that you realize the privileges that you have as a person out in the world, and that can be a little bit stressful, and you think yourself through that, and then you organize that information, and then that influences the way that you behave in a way that is more conducive to equality, and that everybody around you is equal, which is really the goal. For me personally, I don't know, it's so hard because I don't feel like I'm disagreeing that much with this man, but on just like a few little subtle, key, very important details, we're coming at this from a completely different way. This is interesting. We're more than halfway. My eyes are done. Those look fun.
Identities, these low status identities. The only path you have is to adopt a revolutionary identity. Well, what are some revolutionary identities? Ally, activist, and then you never can do those right. But there's one that's totally in the realm of the phenomenological and the subjective that you can pick when nobody's allowed to question it. They're only allowed to affirm you in that environment. And it's some gender or sexual identity that no one's allowed to question. So
That's really interesting. People question it all the time. All the time. I was a queer teacher. I am a queer teacher. That used to be, not so much anymore, because I don't present in such a way to... not so much anymore, because I have the confidence that people don't really want to mess with me, and I think ultimately that's what this is they just want to mess with you. But back when I was not confident and scared and trying to make myself small, which it took a long time to get away from that, you just have to have practice. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I completely lost it. Completely lost it.
To you controversially, and the point of my whole talk now in the last sentence is that the rapid onset gender dysphoria is, yes, partly a social contagion like we've seen in these past models, like we've seen with the recovered memories, or bulimia is another famous example of this. It is partly a social contagion, but it is driven by ideological operators working at the highest levels, including the Department of Education, the U.S. federal government, and the United Nations through UNESCO, to bring this to our children, to transform them into a revolutionary gender or sexual identity that splits them from their family, puts them at odds with their society, leaves them with few options, so they'll be destabilized and wish to revolt, just like Mao's Red Guard.
Oh, buddy. That is quite a reach. That, whew, yeah, Mama had her script printed. She knew, yeah.
Fear is when they're done with them, when they get whatever they want out of this, they will discard them just like Mao did. Thank you.
That is a crazy statement to say, that you think queer ideology exists only to be used to overthrow what is seen as the status quo by some sort of unnamed governmental body, but we're comparing it to a regime that perpetuated a genocide against folks after they were done using them by his terms, and that's what queer ideology is. So we're just all sheeple and pawns being used by big whoever to overthrow the government. Well, if that's what we were placed here to do, we're not doing a great job. We haven't overthrown the government, so as long as we don't overthrow the government, we won't be discarded by this unnamed figure who's manipulating us like a puppet master. Oh, James Lindsay, what are you a doctor in?
Okay, I think I'll start with a comment that hashtag #HagsMad has gotta get out
Hags
there.
mad.
Are you kidding?
Question is for Dr. Lindsay. All right, let's start in the back.
Hi, I'm Corey Cohn. I've been testifying in legislatures in Texas, Indiana, and Ohio, where we've got legislation passed that prohibits doctors from doing sex change procedures on children. So,
like, we're clapping for that. Like, what does that actually mean, those sex change procedures? That is so broad. Are we talking about top surgery? Are we talking about bottom surgery? Are we talking about puberty blockers? Are we talking about hormones? Like, just all the ambiguities make them sound more impressive.
Wisconsin should be someday soon, and we're just going to remove Illinois from the union. Yeah, but every single one of these states that I've been to, there are clergy members who are Episcopalian or United Methodist or other left-wing Protestant denominations who are coming, and their whole mindset is that they want to help these children become their true, authentic selves. I know that you've spoken about Gnosticism before, but I do not want to underestimate how powerful it is that these churches are getting involved and activating their members at the legislative level to try to embed these types of medical procedures in their kids. And they might be Marxists. That might be part of what informs their ideology, because at the seminaries, this is actually something that's starting to become a big deal. But
is this a question?
I'd like you to comment about what Gnosticism is and how that affects the ideology that's associated with gender identity activism.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, too. I appreciate it a lot. So just a quick anecdote, since you mentioned these left-leaning churches, I recently went to speak at Cape Cod, and I got there and I figured I'm in Massachusetts, this is going to be like every color of the rainbow everywhere I turn, on flags, on buildings, whatever. Turns out, no. Every other building, and I mean it, almost like every other house, every other business, almost every other building had an American flag style banners draped across, the front. I'm like, where am I? Is it required because I'm in a, historic American location? And it turns out, no, they're like super into USA. And the only pride flags I saw were flying on churches. Congregationalist, Episcopal, and so on. The only pride flags I saw were flying on churches. It was a really interesting and jarring experience. Now, to be fair, I was in the so-called conservative part of Cape Cod, not down on the end at Provincetown where it's super, super this way. And I also want to mention, just as a second piece here, that, are these people, this question is, are these people knowingly Marxist? It's hard to say. Marxism actually needs to be thought of as kind of a cult value system. You can adopt the values, you can adopt the metaphysics, you can adopt the perspective on the world without knowing a single word of it, without ever having read a single word of it. And so think of it like as a set of new intuitions that point you in a particular direction and a particular behavior. And then you kind of copycat off of people using those general expressions. So you don't actually have to be knowingly Marxist. But so far as the churches go, what we're seeing in those churches that are flying those flags is that they were particularly influenced by a movement that started with the Baptists, of all things. It was called the social gospel, which was actually the infusion by a man named Walter Rauschenbusch of Fabian socialism into American Protestant Christianity starting in 1905. You can look up Rauschenbusch's book. It's called The Social Gospel. You can read it. You can see the
It's funny to hear.
Written down in 1905.
Rauschenbusch.
And the churches have been a vector of bringing these ideas in. The left-leaning churches have been. But since you want me to comment on Gnosticism, I'm going to talk about a queer theorist I didn't mention yet. Two of them, actually. The most famous two, probably, Michel Foucault, who could be considered the founder, and Judith Butler, who is, I call her the fairy godmother of queer theory. I'm sure that would piss her off, which makes me really happy. Hag's mad. But one of their famous sentences, and I'll tell you what Gnosticism is in a second, but one of Foucault's sentences that Judith Butler references repeatedly is it's not so much that the body imprisons the soul as it is that the soul imprisons the body. And then you get Judith talking about how we take our social expectations, so that's like a spiritual force of society, and inscribe it. Literally, that's a word, inscribe it on our external form. So if we're born male and a doctor assigns us male at birth, and then the society, our parents, and everybody says, oh, it's a boy, and we treat it like a boy, then we learn to inscribe on ourselves masculinity, and we grow up and reproduce the performance of masculinity as a male. Whereas Judith Butler would have it, we're doing, even as a man, we're still doing male drag.
Yes.
And if you were born a female, you're still doing female drag, whether you're a woman or not. So the only person that's actually aware of what they're doing is the drag queen, who's now this kind of enlightened soul. And this should throw some color on what's happening now. But the deal with Gnosticism, I use that, it's not so much that the body imprisons the soul as it is that the soul imprisons the body. Who in the hell talks about life as being a prison? Gnostics. The old Gnostic cults going back centuries before Christ, but taking kind of a high watermark in the first century in Christian forms, heretical Christian forms that the early church had to fight and stamp out. Credit to Irenaeus and his book Against Heresies, 800 pages of absolutely being based. It turns out that these believed that the story given in Genesis, the God in Genesis is actually an evil demon that's called the demiurge. That's from the Greek word for builder or artisan, the creator of the world. And he's actually an evil demon who's imprisoning man, who is actually as God already. We are little gods who've been imprisoned in this first Garden of Eden, and then we get kicked out into the miserable world when we try to become, equal by Eve's sin. I throw you to the parallel, by the way, of The Matrix, where the evil Matrix guy, Tommy Lee Jones's character, Agent Smith, says, at first we built you a utopia, but your brains rejected it, so now you get the 1990s. This is the same idea, the same motif. But the idea that reality itself and who we are and how we are expected to be is a prison imposed on us by an evil alien force is the definition of Gnosticism. Gnosis or Gnostic refers to a special interpersonal knowledge of the real truth of reality.
But wasn't he talking about before how there is some special outside force who is making everybody queer? I feel like he said that.
You actually are on the inside would be one way to say that allows you to escape the oppression of the prison. It's much different to suffer in prison when you know you're in prison, and maybe there's a spiritual escape route. And I have made quite controversially as well forwarded the argument that in the early 19th century, the German idealist Hegel, followed by Karl Marx, actually, and preceding them both, the French Jean-Jacques Rousseau, actually, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains, actually forwarded an idea of a social system being the force instead of a spirit, transcendent, demon or whatever.
What is this man talking about? Like, I know I am focused. I know I'm doing my makeup, so I'm not able, but like, what is
mankind in our social norms and expectations, and the goal is to understand that and break free. I call it social Gnosticism or sociological Gnosticism, and I think that queer theory is just a very visible form of that that's being enacted, or gender ideology, on the body. following Butler, they're inscribing on their body the attempt to Gnostically reject the prison that they've been forced into by the powers of society, by the so-called the bourgeois demiurge, or the heteronormative demiurge, if you want, in this case, that's forcing them to be how they actually aren't and obscuring their true nature, in fact, alienating them from their true nature. So I think that fundamentally this is a religious movement posing as a political movement. And if we don't rise up to that, if we keep thinking it's economics and social politics and big medicine, then we're missing 90% of the story.
Yes.
What?
Other questions? You can raise your hand. Here we go.
James, I wondered if you could say more about the moral dimension of this. I'm thinking particularly of therapeutic morality, because it seems to me...
Why aren't we seeing the people who are asking these questions? Show their face.
One of the reasons why this is possible is that our highest good now is the authentic self. And that's what seems to underpin all of the support for transition, particularly in kids. And I almost feel like we're seeing a sort of moral revolution. And I wonder how you square that with the sort of Marxism element.
Sure. So what I just said about Gnosticism all immediately applies exactly. So I'm not going to repeat that. But if you actually look at, say, I mean, we could do this for... Basically, you pick a Marxist through history. I can do it for that Marxist probably if they're big enough that I've read their work. But I'm going to pick a famous one from the 60s who's considered the father of the New Left, who's extremely relevant to our time, Herbert Marcuse. I would say that he was the importer of American Maoism. So he took what this identity politics concept that Mao was using and some of his other ideas and imported those. He got rid of the working class as the base for revolution, and he said the revolution will now be located in the combination of the young intelligentsia in the colleges and universities combined with the members of the ghetto populations, namely gender and sexual minority. Well, he just said sexual minorities.
He said the word ghetto a lot. I mean, he would roast me for saying that's not politically correct or inappropriate, but I maybe I don't understand his point for the use of that word as well.
You know, homosexuals, women, feminists, racial minorities, and other outsiders, including the mentally ill. Those are going to be paired with the young intelligentsia with new ideology in order to affect the revolution. And so the way that he said that this would be done was through what he called a transvaluation of values. He actually titled the chapter in the Essay on Liberation in 1969, he titled it A Biological Foundation for Socialism. And then he immediately, the first time he uses the word, uses an asterisk, and he says, I don't mean biology literally like eugenics. I mean transforming people at the level of their basic vital needs so that their instinctual habits and behaviors reflect the pursuit of socialism because they find the capitalist-driven world unbearable and impossible to live in. And the entirety of the first two chapters of that essay are about creating a new set of values, identifying true versus false needs, and pursuing only the true needs and dropping the false needs. And ultimately coming up with a new set of values that, in his words, are a great refusal of the existing society. In fact, not just a great refusal, a protest against, in his own words, the entirety of a prosperous, well-functioning society. Indeed, a protest against its very form. So even the Platonic ideal of a capitalist society and a well-functioning, prosperous society is out the window. And he says the way this is going to happen is to bring a new moral...
So he's fighting for capitalism, yeah. I could talk right now about how capitalism is garbage and is only serving the top 1%, but you know that. You know that watching this video. What do we get out of watching the rich people get richer? Nothing, girl. This is weird.
He calls it a new sensibility through this radical vanguard that I just mentioned. So there's this attempt to create this new value system, and I think it piggybacks off of Maoism, but not that Mao is any great humanitarian or famous for caring about people. But I think one of the inroads that it found in American culture is that we do care about people who are hurting. I think of the church sign that was up in my neighborhood near my neighborhood for a long time that said, "We love hurting people," which church sign jokes never fail to amuse me.
Jesus.
We care about people who are in pain. So this therapeutic culture, especially coming out of the pop psychology of the 60s, 70s, Oprah Winfrey in the 80s and 90s, mainstreaming a lot of this. By the way, she's also a transform the world. She's not a Christian, by the way. Oprah Winfrey is a theosophist. That's another story altogether. All of this was mainlined as kind of the new kind of basis for this value system, and the buzzword that's used for it that attaches to these issues is inclusion. everything has to be inclusive, 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 inclusive. That turns out to be a program that was derived by Lenin and Stalin in the early 1920s that was applied as the second priority of the Soviet Union, according to their writings, and then it was reformed in this very therapeutic form in mostly the 1970s around race and sexual minorities in order to kind of have a soft entryism, as the Soviets call it, to get in. So I think there has been an undermining of our value system where it's actually low status, or it's actually chauvinistic was a word used in the communist countries, to hold to American values or to real values that actually help people prosper. And so you have to have this kind of, I don't know, inclusion is the right word. You have to be a pushover and accommodate and enable all the time. So we've moved into a weird upside down therapeutic culture where actually the first priority, say if you had an addict or whatever, look at the drug situation on the West Coast, is to enable the problem in a clean way or whatever, rather than to try to help them find a solution to the problem. And I think that maps so one-to-one for this gender dysphoria problem that it doesn't even need elaboration to say what's going on there.
I love that. What a good sentence. It doesn't even need elaboration to know what's going on there.
Okay, I think this will be last question.
Yeah, I talk a lot.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Thank you, James. So what role should and can parents be playing in ending this ideology?
Parents have got to get very hands-on with their children, not in the literal sense. They've got to get very involved in their lives. Oh no, you have to engage with your kids. We've spent a lot of time.
Yes, okay, that's true.
And if you ask your average parent right now, why don't you want to homeschool? Just as an example, not necessarily everybody wants to. If you ask them, why don't you want to? Invariably, the two answers that you get most commonly are, I don't know how, and that's a matter of that's easy to get around. Oh, there's all these resources, let me get you in a network, blah, blah, blah. Done, right? So that's a real excuse for people.
Well, no, you don't just get resources and then you know how to teach, but resources would help. Yeah, that was weird.
Ignorance, but it's easily overcome. And the other one is, how am I going to have daycare?
Yeah.
Who's going to take care of my kids when I go to work? How am I going to do it with me going to work? And so parents have got to get a lot more directly involved. When I said hands-on, that's what I mean, directly involved in their kids' lives. You have to start asking them questions. You're going to have to learn about this ideology, gender ideology and or queer theory specifically, but also the broader nexus of all of these. They're progressive in the strict sense, but they're not moving society in a better direction since these ideas like critical race theory and queer theory and disability studies and so on, these very leftist, or I would actually tell you, Marxist interpretations of difference in society, you're going to have to get at least basic level informed and conversant in them. I've spent the last 6 years trying to produce a library of materials for people to do that, and you're more than welcome to use mine. Other people have run off and done excellent work. I encourage you to use theirs. If you think I'm crazy, that's fine. I don't care. I'm a bad element. That's okay. Use somebody else's. I don't care. Alvin's in the back. He's got great resources. I don't care. Moms for Liberty is putting out great resources. They're great. But you've got to understand enough to have the real conversations with your kids, basically to effect an inoculation. They have to know. The old saying is that you prepare the child for the road. You don't prepare the road for the child. We obviously see that the logic of society is the opposite with this safetiest, therapeutic helicopter parent, kid in a bumper suit model that we kind of live right now. That's wrong. You've got to prepare your kid for the road, and part of the road right now is rapid onset gender dysphoria, and in my opinion, the ideological pressure pump to drive kids into it. So you better prepare them for that road. It is your job, parents, to take the responsibility.
And do you prepare them for that road by talking about that explicitly? Like, are you preparing them for that road by saying, hey, gender doesn't exist, and if you hear this garbage, make sure to not think for yourself and only listen to what I'm telling you now? Or are they just teaching critical thinking skills so those kids are able to think about things before they work them into their way of thinking? It's a very stark difference. My argument would be is that most parents try and teach against gender identity. That's, of course, it makes sense, because then if you try and teach them specifically critical thinking skills, then they might critically think against the nonsense that you're spewing. So it is self-serving, so I understand that, but still it's manipulative.
To raise your children to prepare for the world that they're going to enter. So you've got to do that. You've got to become informed yourself, and you've got to make that bond. Part of the biggest point of these ideologies, in particular the queer theory ideologies or gender ideologies, are specifically to put your children in a position where they will reject you as their parents. They are doing something that they know or they're told, yo, your parents won't like this, so don't tell them. The school will keep your secret. We're a trusted adult. Your parents might not be. This is a design to put a division. We're going to have one identity for you at school that you get to live out, and you can do whatever your parents make you do at home.
Yeah, it just makes it sound so nefarious in nature when in fact those safeguards of not telling parents are because of documented cases where parents were not good to their children because of these things. It was put in for safety, not... Yeah, it's the way he's describing this information is designed in such a way to make it sound nefarious and deceptive when it's not. It fundamentally, at the end of the day, as messed up as our school systems are in North America, you walk into a school, 9 teachers out of 10 actually care for the best thing about students. It's not some conspiracy theory to keep you out of whatever. It's just not the reality.
Feel like they're gnostically in prison at home, and they get to be liberated when they're in the school. And so what you've got to do is get involved. If you can, get completely involved. Homeschool is the best option, period. Plus, you're going to get involved in a group that's fighting for freedom more than anybody else. I understand not everybody can do it. So you've got to get involved directly with your children, and you've got to get involved in organizations and activities like this that are going to actually bring us over the top of that curve. I don't know where we are, Tiffany, on that curve either, but we need to get over the top of that curve that's medicalizing and socially transitioning kids, and we have to be involved in organizations like this, sharing information, giving courage to people who need it, and network to people who need it, so that we can do that. So parents, get off the couch, get with your kids, and then show up and get informed and activated. Thank you.
Well, kids, that's the end. I have a fully painted face. I feel like I look so pasty. Sometimes you just gotta serve reality, so I'll just change the lighting in here so I don't look too ghastly dull. But yes, thank you for getting to the end of this video. I know it's been a very long one, so if you enjoyed this, I do have another very similar reaction video to this about Genspect. You can watch my other Dismantling Hate videos. That rolls on the playlist here at the end of this video. Thanks for spending this time with me. I'm gonna go film some other videos, you know, be a sex positive radical feminist. Oh, my nose hairs are so long. And on that, I will see you next week. Goodbye.